And now it's Deborah Kobylt Live.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me today on Deborah Kobylt Live. I have a special guest joining us. So thrilled to have you here, Lisa Guerrero, who wrote this amazing book. Everybody, please pick it up. Warrior, My Path to Being Brave. Gosh, Lisa, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure, Deborah. Thank you for having me.
You hardly need an introduction, but in case, for folks who aren't quite sure, Lisa has been with Inside Edition as a chief investigative correspondent for 17 years. You've worked at KCBS as a sports anchor. Also, we all know you from Monday Night Football. You've been in Playboy. Just your story is forever long, right? But most of all, you are a warrior, and you're here to talk to us about that, about your career, about why you're a warrior, and why did you write this book, please?
So, I started writing the book years ago. I was, as you mentioned, I was a sports reporter at KCBS, then Fox 11, then Fox Sports Net. And I found myself being one of the very few women covering sports back in the 80s and 90s. And I knew that I had a bunch of funny stories, interesting stories, stories that sports fans would be interested in. So I started writing thinking, I want to make sure I document what's going on around me because it's crazy. Wow. Outrageous situations. But then as I grew in my career, I started to realize that what I was experiencing was actually misogyny and was, certain forms of sexual harassment and, inappropriate toxic behavior. And I started to look back at my sportscasting career through a different lens. Now that I'm 58, I'm older, I'm experienced, I've been on camera for 40 years of my life. I now look back at certain parts of my career and I think that was a red flag. I should have recognized that. I should have set my boundaries earlier and with more power behind the intent. So now when I look back at my career, I see these really specific moments that I should have been more aware of. So the book I was originally going to write, which was kind of a funny tell-all about being a woman in sports, turned into a book about resilience, about being able to rebrand yourself after personal or professional trauma, which I've experienced both. And I started to take the book very seriously. And I realized that my book is my legacy. It's going to be a lot more than just a bunch of stories, but what is the takeaway? If people are going to spend $28 on a book, I want them to be able to, of course, be entertained, but I want to leave them with nuggets of wisdom and something that they can work on themselves. That's when I came up with this notion of making the book about my name. So Guerrero, my last name, Guerrero, comes from my mother, who was a Chilean immigrant to this country. And when she was 29 and I was 8 years old, she was diagnosed with lymphoma. But before she died, she pulled me aside and she said, Lisita, never forget that your last name is Guerrero, and Guerrero means warrior. You were born to fight. And that's how I came up with the theme of my book. So as you can see, Deborah, that is a very long answer to your very short, concise question. But there was a lot to put in there because the whole journey to writing this book has changed drastically through the years.
I love that you brought up your mom. And of course, you're very close with your dad. He's really your number one champion and has been through his, your entire life, and his, of course, and he is still with us, thank goodness. And I'm so sorry you lost your mom at such a young age, because that you carry with through life with you too. And that's, I know, very, very difficult. But I remember once in the book, you said people would look at you and feel badly for you that you didn't have a mom. But then could you tell us what you said about your dad?
Sure. So I actually dedicated this book to my father. And on the dedication page, I say, the other kids felt sorry for me because I didn't have a mom, but I felt sorry for them because they didn't have my dad. So the book is dedicated to Walter Coles, my dad, who raised me and my little brother. My mom died when I was 8 and my brother Richard was 6. And my dad, in his early 30s, a widower, changed his entire career path so that he quit his job as a social worker for the Salvation Army, and he worked from home as a consultant for the Salvation Army so that he could help us with our homework, so he could go to every sporting event with us and every concert and rehearsal. So my dad really changed the focus of his life after his wife died in order to raise his children as a single dad.
That's really incredible, because he didn't go out to find another mom for you kids, right? He kept the family unit together in her honor, really. And I know that you enjoyed sports with dad, which was obviously, because I'm a big believer, like whoever we were when we were little, whatever was going on, listen to that, people, because that's who we end up becoming a little later on in life, right? So what was your first foray, if you will, into journalism, into sports reporting?
So my dad raised me as a sports fan because he was a huge sports fan. And he never told me that girls can't play sports. So I thought I was going to be a quarterback for the Chargers. We grew up in San Diego before moving to Huntington Beach when I was a teenager. But when I was a kid, I was a Chargers fan. And he would take me to the Chargers games. And I would say, Dad, I want to be the quarterback. And he said, okay, let's get in the backyard. You need to throw a perfect spiral. And so I was a tomboy. And later, when I was in high school and I had a growth spurt and I started to learn how to put on makeup and how to carry myself, I was discovered by a modeling agent. But at the same time, I was this big sports fan. So I would carry to all of my auditions and all of my bookings and all of my assignments, I'd carry the sports page with me. So the directors and I would be laughing and I'd be joking around with the camera crew about, the Lakers or the Dodgers or whatever. And they would say to me, Lisa, you should really think about being a sports reporter, because there's nobody that looks like you that's covering sports. Of course, this was back in the 80s. At the same time, I was considering trying out to be a Rams cheerleader. And I was on a junior college cheerleading team at Golden West College, but I wasn't good enough to make cheerleading in high school. So I actually didn't think I would make it. But I tried out. I made the Rams in 1984 and became a Rams cheerleader. But I remember being at the games and looking over the sidelines, because we're on the sidelines, but so are the male reporters that were covering the team. And I remember looking over at all of those men and saying to the girl, the cheerleader next to me, someday I'm going to do that. I'm going to be a sideline reporter someday. I'm going to be a sports reporter. And she said, girls aren't sports reporters. And I said, oh yeah, watch me. And a few years later, I became one of Los Angeles's first female sportscasters. I think the first Latina sportscaster in the United States. And of course, the first Latina on Monday Night Football. And like I said, one of the very few women covering sports those days in the locker rooms. So that cheerleading opportunity helped lead me to a dream of being a sportscaster.
Yeah, everybody, just note, a common theme throughout this interview. I'm going to be a sports reporter, right? That's what you said. And then when you went over to KCBS, right, you sort of had to talk them into giving you that job. And once again, that same person, you wanted something and you went after it. Can you tell our people about that?
Sure. I remember, really struggling. I had been on a little cable sports show in New England, but I didn't have a journalism background. I didn't start in a small market working my way up as a sports reporter. I had an agent, Ken Lindner, who believed in me. He saw this tape of me on this crazy cable show, and he thought that I could make an impact immediately in sportscasting. So, he sent me out on an audition, basically a meeting, to be the weekend sports guy for KCBS. And of course, the main sports anchor there was then and still is Jim Hill. But at the time, they were looking for somebody to replace the old weekend sports guy. So they were looking for a new sports guy. And so I took the meeting. And of course, I was the only woman up against probably 40 other men from different markets and different levels of broadcastability. But I walked in and I said to the news director and the sports director, you need me. I'm Latina. I'm a woman. There are more and more sports fans that are women, especially here in Los Angeles. And if you go to a Dodgers game and you go up to the upper level, they're all Latinos. So where's the representation here
Wow.
in Los Angeles on camera for women and for Latinos? You should hire me. And believe it or not, they hired me. The audacity really at that, being young and being unafraid and just being so sure that I would be good for that station and that the viewers deserved to
Wow.
see representation. Even before people were talking about representation matters, I just knew that having a Guerrero, having my last name on the chyron was going to be impactful for this market in Los Angeles. And it was. So from the day that I ended up getting hired, ratings went up. And all of a sudden, the other stations were scrambling to find the next Lisa Guerrero. So I think I really opened the doors in Los Angeles for other women to get opportunities. So I was the first woman in Los Angeles to get a contract from KCBS as a sportscaster.
Monday Night Football. What was that like? Because what I'm getting to is some of the abuses that you write about very clearly in your book, because we've all had that guy in broadcasting, but you, I think, had it a whole different level, Lisa Guerrero, I have to tell you, because you were brave to write about it. So thank you. I also like that you gave him an opportunity to respond, letting him know that you were writing about this in the book. Loved his response, which was, "Oh, I don't recall it that way." Talk to me about that, Lisa. How you were brave enough to do that, and talk to us about some of the moments that nearly brought you down. And I mean, nearly brought you down, like that drive on the PCH. Would you?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I get hired as a local sports reporter on CBS, and very quickly, Fox 11 came after me. And so I went there, and then their ratings went up. And because I was at Fox 11, David Hill, who at the time was running Fox Sports Net, saw me, brought me over to Fox Sports Net, and quickly I became a national presence, regional on Southern California Sports Report and nationally on Sports Geniuses, the best damn sports show, period, where I was the first female host of that show. And I was just getting a lot of opportunities, sitting down with massive big stars like Barry Bonds, Shaquille O'Neal, Alex Rodriguez, Mia Hamm. And so I was really sure that my dream would come true. And my dream at the time was I wanted to be the Barbara Walters of sports. I wanted to do sit-down interviews with superstar, difficult athletes and get the most that I could out of them. So that was my dream. And I was on my way to achieving this. And, but finally at Fox Sports Net on the best damn sports show, period, I was on a show that was really, it was a boys club. And it was not only a boys club, it was more like a frat house, honestly. And there was a ton of misogyny and ridiculous shenanigans going on behind the scenes and on camera. And I became really uncomfortable with that show. I ended up leaving Fox Sports Net, and immediately ABC came after me as the new sideline reporter for Monday Night Football. And I was reluctant at first because I had never been a sideline reporter. I had been a sports anchor. I'd been a correspondent. I had been a beat reporter for MLB, NBA, the NFL, but I had never been a sideline reporter, which is a very specific skill set. But they convinced me to do it because I was told they wanted to do the sideline reporting in a new way. They wanted it to be entertainment meets sports. So I wasn't going to be X's and O's on the sidelines. I was going to be up in the stands talking about, cultural, pop culture items. If there's celebrities in the stand, we'll talk about that. Of course, cover the game. But they thought that Monday Night Football was an event, and they wanted it to be covered as more than just sports, but as a cultural event every Monday night. And I loved that idea. So I said yes. But immediately, the sports media critics hated me. They came out of the woodwork. And first of all, they slammed where I was from. They said, she's from Los Angeles. And of course, the big eye roll. She was a cheerleader for the NFL. Like, they gave the microphone for Monday Night Football to a cheerleader. And so, of course, I was an actress and a model. So they really started to slut shame me across the country on sports radio, in USA Today. on ESPN. You know, I was really getting an enormous amount of criticism based on the fact that I was a former cheerleader and model. And they ignored the 10 years of work that I had just done in Los Angeles as a sportscaster. And so they really demeaned me and belittled me before my first game for Monday Night Football. And I was heartbroken over this. I was sick over this, combined with the fact that I had an executive producer that was verbally abusive to me, that would yell at me, that would demean me and leave me in tears constantly. So I was riddled with anxiety. I began to get depressed. I absorbed all of this criticism like a sponge. And one of the reasons I wrote Warrior is I want people to know that bullying and verbal abuse and toxic environments, all of those things have consequences. There's somebody on the receiving end of bullying and of extreme criticism, of slut shaming. And that at the time was me. And it was very, very brutal, and it was national, and it was humiliating. I immediately lost weight. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I couldn't concentrate. I was shaking. I was scared. I thought I was going to get fired any minute. And as soon as I misspoke at the end of the first regular season game, I thought, there we go. That's it. They're going to fire me now because I made a mistake live. And even though I corrected it immediately live, it was too late because I gave the critics what they wanted, which was a big mistake to point to so that they can say, see, she's just a bimbo. She doesn't really know sports. And I was devastated. So as the season continued and I continued to have these, horrible, anxious feelings and these really troubling thoughts, I started to think about self-harm and, what if I were to just, I just started thinking these horrible, horrible things, that I just wasn't worthy of this job, not just the job, but I wasn't worthy of living. That's how bad it was. There was an entire column written about my nail polish at one point, and that almost put me over the edge because I thought they're not listening to my reporting. They don't care about who I am as a storyteller anymore. They care more about what I look like than anything. So go ahead.
For those people who might be saying, hey, they give it to the guys. No, they don't. Women are not getting the same types of, if you want to use the word, abuse. The guys will get a little bit of ribbing and stuff like that. Criticism, yeah, but it's a whole different level, people. I mean, I think that's very, very important for people to understand. It's a whole different level to bring a woman down. And that's exactly what was happening to you. And it's happened to so many of us. And there was one moment in particular, but I think maybe you were getting to it, when you were live on the air. And let's just say you had an incident that was so unfortunate and so horrific. Please, would you tell us about it?
I considered not writing this. I considered not including this in my book because it is so horrific. But in the end, I thought, I'm writing a book and I'm going to be honest about what happened to me. And I think this really illustrates how bad it got for me. So towards the end of the season, I was heading into a game. I was sick as usual. I had just thrown up before the game, which was typical. And in the end of the first quarter, I started to have cramps and some pain in my side. And just shortly before this, I realized I had been pregnant. I took a pregnancy test. I had been recently engaged, and I was probably anywhere between 8 and 12 weeks pregnant at the time. So here I was during the game, and I started to feel this pain. And I realized at halftime that I had begun to miscarry on the field live. But I was so afraid of my boss, and I was so afraid of the criticism if I would have left, if I would have called 911, which I should have done, and gone immediately to the emergency room. Instead, I'm in a strange city. I decide to button up my coat so that nobody can see the blood leaking through. And I continued on the second half of that game. I plastered a smile on my face and continued to forge through that game. And at the end of the game, when I was on the plane home, I took off those pants, which were bloody, and I threw them in the trash can, put my sweats on, And I thought to myself, I think I've lost everything now. I've lost my dignity. I'm definitely going to lose this job. I knew it was coming. And now I've lost a pregnancy. And what else can they take from me? But that really wasn't as bad as it got, because there were still a couple more games. I continued the season. I continued to endure a lot of criticism. And finally, I was fired. And after I was fired, I thought, I'm going to kill myself. I have no reason to live. Even though I had just gotten engaged, I was in love. I lived in a fancy house in Malibu. People thought I was living this incredible life. But my whole identity was as a sports person, a sportscaster. And I had been publicly humiliated on the biggest stage there ever was in sports broadcasting, Monday Night Football. And I had now brought shame to my mother's name. I was no longer a warrior. I was no longer a guerrero. I was embarrassed and ashamed everywhere I went. And finally, I was driving down PCH. I was listening to sports radio as usual, which I shouldn't have done. But they were talking about me and laughing about me, just having been fired. And I almost drove my car off of PCH. That's how bad. And right before, I thought about all of the cruelty that I had heard, and those demeaning remarks, and the cruelty I had heard on the radio and in the newspapers. Again, this is why we need to think about these negative things in the media, because somebody's on the receiving end of them. So all this to say, I obviously didn't. I instead pulled over and I called my dad, and I opened up to him and I shared my experiences with him, because I hadn't told him before what I was going through. And he said to me, Lisa, you are a storyteller. There's a whole world of news out there that's not just about sports. There are people in this world, Lisa, who don't even know who's playing in the Super Bowl. And it's like, you're right. But of course, I wasn't thinking about that. I only thought about my little bubble of sports.
Yeah.
And when he said that, something triggered in me that kind of opened up my eyes, so that I realized that he was right. I'm a reporter. Yeah. I'm a storyteller. And it's okay to not cover sports. I can cover entertainment or news or breaking news or investigations. And so between that and me deciding to go to therapy, which was crucial, that was a crucial decision, I was able to recover from that. That was 17 years ago. Now I'm living my best life, and I'm living the dream that I almost can't believe. I pinch myself every day that I get to chase bad guys for a living and help people. But had I not gone through that trauma that I went through, Deborah, I wouldn't be as empathetic as I am today. And it's my empathy that drives me to help chase those bad guys and to help bring justice to the survivors of the investigations I do on Inside Edition.
They're outstanding. I mean, and when I see you running after people, because you're right, you're a storyteller. And frankly, you're telling the stories that somebody else might not be telling. This is critical. It's crucial. There's so many people telling the story, perhaps not as well as you did, of a Barry Bonds, et cetera, but so many people who need justice and need these stories to be heard. That's now where you landed, which I believe is where you always belong. But as you said yourself, you had to go through this, which is pretty terrible, but you had to go through it. We all have to go through something, big pain, to get to that moment. Now, do you mind if I ask a little bit about Playboy? Because, you know, ironically, you decided to talk to Playboy. Talk to us about that, because that, interestingly enough, led to Inside Edition, right?
It did. You know, 20 years before, when I was in my early 20s, I was a model. And I had done a bunch of swimwear campaigns. I was a fitness model. I was the spokesmodel for Gold's Gym. And having grown up in Southern California, I was very comfortable in my body. Being a Latina, I'm very comfortable with my femininity, my sexuality. But when I was in my 20s, I kept getting asked by Playboy to be a playmate. And at the time I said no, because I wanted to be an actress and I wanted to be a broadcaster. At the time I wanted to be a sportscaster. And I just knew that at that time it would have been a bad decision for me. So I said no to them. And it kind of became this running joke where every year they'd come back to me asking for me to be a playmate. I kept saying no. As my career progressed in the world of broadcasting and acting, they came back to me asking me to be a celebrity cover for Playboy. And again, I kept saying no. So 20 years go by, Deborah. Finally, I was married. Monday Night Football was behind me. I didn't know what was ahead of me. And I didn't have a career plan at that point. And Playboy again, on the dot, they send me another file, giving me another offer to be on the cover. And I threw it away as usual. But my husband at the time, he picked it out of the garbage and he said, "What is this?" And I said, "Playboy asked me every year to do this. Of course, I'm not going to pose for Playboy." And he said, "Why not? You're not covering sports anymore. You're between jobs. This is an iconic brand. You're 40 and a Latina. How many brunettes, 40-year-olds are on the cover of Playboy?" And as we read the proposal, they said I didn't have to be nude. I could choose the photographer. I could choose the city. Wow. It was an enormous amount of money. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to use Playboy because they're going to have a platform, because all of the cover celebrities get to do a publicity tour. So I'm going to tell anybody that listens that I want to do entertainment reporting next. I had been a sports reporter. Now I want to work for a news magazine. And so I took this huge risk. I did the cover of Playboy. I did not show frontal nudity. So I was able to pick the pictures and I picked a fashion photographer, not a Playboy photographer. And I decided I wanted to go to Paris because I'd never been to Paris. So they flew me, my mother-in-law, my female manager, and my girlfriend, my best friend, out to Paris for the week to shoot the cover and to shoot the inside pictorial. And it was a fabulous experience. It was so empowering. It was amazing. I loved it. And then I did the cover publicity and I told everybody I wanted to break into, entertainment reporting. And Inside Edition heard me and they did a story about me being on the cover. And believe it or not, a couple of days later, they offered me a 2-year contract as the West Coast correspondent for Inside Edition. And that 2 years turned into 17 years because since 2010, I've been their chief investigative correspondent. So I got promoted along the line. And here I am. Thanks to Playboy, I'm chasing bad guys for Inside Edition. It's a crazy story.
It's a great story, is what it is. And now, of course, you're doing a piece on Playboy. I'm going to get to that in a little bit because you talked about your then husband. I love that you ended up meeting him by doing a story on Barry Bonds, right? And his publicist. Can you tell our audience about that?
Everybody in sports wanted to interview Barry Bonds. Barry Bonds hates the media and very rarely did any interviews, especially sit-down, long-form interviews. And I begged my producers at Best Damn Sports Show, period, to let me try to get him. And they rolled their eyes. Okay, sure, Lisa, good luck getting Barry Bonds. Yeah. And I said, if I get him to say yes, will you commit a camera crew for me so that I could go up there and get the interview if he says yes? And they were like, yeah, sure, of course. If Barry Bonds says yes, we'll give you a camera crew. And they kind of patted me on the head and showed me out the door. It took me months, but I scored the Barry Bonds sit-down interview because first of all, I contacted his agent, Scott Boris, his publicist, Rachel Viscara, his manager, Stevie, all his best friends. I was bugging everybody, sending them tapes, calling constantly. And finally, he agreed to sit down with me. So this huge interview really helped. It made my career as a young sportscaster. But while we were chatting during the interview, he looks at his publicist and he looks at me. And actually, it was just after the interview ended. This wasn't on camera. This was right after we're done and we're wrapping up. He looks at his publicist, he looks at me and he goes, Lisa should meet Scott Erickson. Don't you think he should, you should meet Scott? And Rachel agreed because Rachel represented Barry and Scott Erickson. And so they colluded and they gave Scott my cell phone number and he called me and I hung up on him. And I hung up on him several times because I said I'm never going to date a ball player. And finally, he talked me into it and we went out and we got married. And even though we're divorced and we were married for 17 years, is it 17? Has it been 17 years, 15 years? We're still really good friends. We just decided that we were going in very different directions. We were two different, at the time he was an athlete and I was a sportscaster. We had a lot in common, but then our lives really grew apart. But we decided to remain really great friends, which I'm so grateful for.
But when the marriage broke up, it also wasn't so easy because he sort of surprised you with, I don't think I want to be married anymore. Nothing personal.
Yeah.
There was no other woman, nobody else in his life. And once again, another blow for Lisa, right? That's tough too. Yeah. I mean, how many did you have to pile on at the same time? Honestly, Lisa.
So many, I had to write a book about it. Honestly. Yeah. It's like people read the book and even some of my best friends don't know all the stories in this book. And I get these phone calls or these texts like, oh my God, chapter 3. Oh my Lord, what happened? Chapter 15. Why didn't you tell me about chapter 7? So I've had a lot of very challenging experiences. But the point of the book, it's called Warrior, Not Victim. So I am not a victim. I have learned from every single thing, every single obstacle I've turned into an opportunity. So you take the obstacle, you turn it into an opportunity. You take the pain, you turn it into power. And that is my lesson at the end of the book, where I talk about becoming more brave. And you can only be a brave person if you are forged through adversity. Bravery doesn't come from getting everything handed to you and living an easy life. Bravery comes from meeting challenges head on and accomplishing something.
But none of us realize it at the time, right? It'll bring you down to your knees. And if you can just get up from, being on your knees, that's when we learn the lessons. And as we look back on it, you're right. That's our strongest time. And I love how you've also said that you wrote this book for all the other little or young Lisas out there going through something similar in any field, right? But that's what this is too. It's for someone like me who's been through it all, for someone like a little Lisa or a little Tommy, right? Because my husband was interested in this book as well, as was one of my sons. He goes, oh, I got to read that. And it's sitting on our table and people are picking it up at night to read your book. This isn't just for young girls. Go ahead.
No, that I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was the real shocking thing for me. I wrote this book as a love letter to women. Young women starting in the business, women our age that have had experience. It wasn't written to women, but I thought that's who I thought women were going to connect to it, and they have. Thank goodness, they really have. But what surprised me is how many men have loved the book, responded to the book, have written to me, have posted about it, have tweeted about it, have wanted to interview me on their shows. I mean, the Sports Illustrated ran one of my chapters, and the editor called me, just choked up about it. And the way that it has moved men has meant the world to me, because I'm a big fan of men. My dad raised me. The book is dedicated to my dad. And so, it's not this book about, men bashing or misogyny. Yes, misogyny happened to me. That was one thing that happened to me at certain parts of my career. But the overarching theme is really about evolution, the evolution of me, specifically, and the stories that I tell are the ways I grew. But also there is an evolution in our culture right now. I think things are getting better for women. Although I think we, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's not linear. We are going, slowly into a better place, I believe. But I also think that there's an evolution with men. And I think that because of the Me Too movement, Time's Up, I think that men are realizing how much of what women had to endure was so unfair. And maybe they didn't realize it. And maybe they didn't even realize their own behavior until it was pointed out to them. And so one of the big surprises was not just how many men loved the book, but also how many men reached out to me that once were abusive to me in the media. There was one, I could not believe, there was a radio sports guy that was awful to me back then, who called to apologize. What is this, 17, 18 years later? At 20 years later, it's 20 years since Monday Night Football, 20 years later. And he, believe it or not, said, Lisa, I need to tell you that I am sorry.
Wow.
I read your book and I'm ashamed of myself. And now I have 2 daughters and I wouldn't want anybody to do to them what I did to you. I mean, I was blown away. I was so touched by that. But at the same time, I thought it shouldn't have taken him to have 2 daughters for him to know right from wrong and to know that what he did was cruel.
Yeah.
So.
Oh my gosh. And you know, I know you have to go because you're in San Francisco and you're actually working on an investigative piece. And I really appreciate the time. But I want people to know out there, you write all kinds of fun stuff to talk about, right? Some of the people you've interviewed, you know, from Kobe Bryant to Dennis Rodman, right? You made Dennis cry. Okay. You were also on The View because, you know, Barbara Walters was your, you know, you wanted to be the Barbara Walters of sports, but, you know, that didn't quite go so great with Barbara, right? If you want to talk about some of it a little bit, great. But I just wanted our people to know that you got some big nuggets in this book, not just about what happened to you, but just about your illustrious career. It's quite outstanding. And you're acting.
Thank you.
My gosh, you've been in films, major films. You've been on TV shows. There's so much to you, Lisa. I don't know how many, you know, you have more hours in your day than I think rest of us do.
You know what? It's because I don't have kids. My friends go, how do you have time to do all this? And of course, they've got 3 children and, you know, they're busy moms that are working and raising kids at the same time. So I was able to really focus on my career, which was really great. And, you know, there was a time when I thought, you know, briefly that maybe I did want to have a child because I was in love when I got engaged to Scott, but that didn't happen. Obviously, I had the miscarriage I mentioned, and I never got pregnant again. So it wasn't in the cards for me to have kids. So I focused 100% of my time and energy toward what I believe are the reasons for me to have made it through those dark times. My purpose in life, I believe, is to help people, is to shine a light on injustice. I want to help my dad and my family and my friends. I want to be a loyal, true friend. I want to be a good person. I want to be an honest person. And so I think part of that is wrapped up in what I do as an investigative reporter and a host. I also host Secrets of Playboy. We're getting ready to come back with season 2. And that's an amazing show on A&E that's going to start up starts airing this summer, but we already shot it. So we're editing it right now. It's going to be a tremendous new season. So I feel like all of the work that I'm doing is for the greater good. And that's what gets me up every morning. And that's why I hit the coffee machine. There's stuff to do.
Yeah. There is stuff to do. Thanks. There's always stuff to do, people. At your lowest moment, there's stuff to do. Pick up this book, Warrior, My Path to Being Brave. You're very brave, Lisa, but you're right. You're very kind, and you come off so sincere because you are sincere. You really want other people to know that you got to keep going. You got to be brave. That's the definition of a warrior. You just have to keep moving, even when you don't want to. I believe that I heard from someone that this book could perhaps be turned into something, maybe a series, maybe a film. Am I getting ahead of myself?
Well, we have had some incredible interest in taking the book and turning it into a scripted series. So it was one of the most shocking things were the phone calls that started to come in when people read the book, when the book was first released, 2 months ago. We've had so much interest in either making it into a documentary series or a scripted series. So right now I have, Gotham Group is my management company, and they represent authors that, are having their projects developed. And it looks like I'm going to get a show out of this thing. So it's really been a blessing, an honor, and it's just a complete shock. But I'm so grateful. So yeah, more news on that to come shortly. Hopefully we'll get a deal in place by this summer.
Thanks so much, Lisa, for joining us today. Any parting words that you want to give to your friends, your family, our listeners and viewers?
I write in the book about bravery. Commit a random act of bravery every day. Everybody listening right now and watching this, there is some challenge in your life. There is somebody you're afraid of. There's some obstacle that you're worried about. If you read my book, you will see that there are steps that you can take to become more brave every day. But just do this one thing. Every single day, find one reason to do a brave thing that you hadn't thought about doing before. And if you do one brave thing a day, when the time comes where you need to do a big, brave thing, you will have the courage to do it.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody, please pick up Warrior, My Path to Being Brave. It's such an outstanding read. And again, not just for us girls, but the men are loving it too. My husband's all over this book. He just loved it. He remembers your career and he's followed your career, and he knows what I've been through as a broadcaster in my career. Yeah. God knows we've got these horrendous stories. So reading this, he even understood more about me, understood more about his mom, an immigrant family. So this is just such a terrific read. Thank you so much for joining us. And please, people, tell your friends about our interview. It's on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and then, of course, on all audio platforms, whether it's iHeart, Amazon, everywhere, Apple, you'll find our show, Deborah Kobylt Live. So please invite your friends. My name is Deborah Zara Kobylt. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.